Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson & Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Susanna Blair, Senior Director of Regulatory and Technical Affairs at the Consumer Brands Association, otherwise known as CBA, which represents the interest of the consumer packaged goods community. Having left the United States Environmental Protection Agency after a distinguished career as a senior scientist and policy expert, Dr. Blair is putting her science policy chops to good use at CBA. We discuss CBA's mission, its focus on food and beverage ingredients, how Make America Healthy Again, MAHA advocacy has impacted CBA, the association's focus on the generally recognized as safe GRAS framework, among other priority projects CBA is pursuing, and much more. Now, here is my conversation with Dr. Susanna Blair. Well, welcome, Susanna. It was lovely to see you at Tosca 10 years later, or a month or so ago, and I'm just so thrilled that you're here today and we're having this conversation.
Hi, Lynn. It's such a pleasure to be here. You are an institution, maybe, in my sliver of the DC policy world. So it really is my pleasure to be here with you.
You're very kind to say that. What I'd like to do, with your permission, is start with you. I mean, you have such a fascinating background. You have a PhD in geological sciences before joining Consumer Brands Association, which is very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
I knew you, and you know many of my colleagues here at Bergeson & Campbell through your work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. You've served in a number of leadership and policy and science positions. One question that I have, and many of our listeners might be asking, is what led you to a career in science and motivated you to devote all the time and effort that you did to perfecting your considerable skills at EPA?
Oh, well, thank you for all of that. Yeah, so I do have a PhD in geology from the University of Florida, though I can't say I could do much mineral identification anymore, unfortunately. My dissertation was pretty technical. I spent a lot of late nights in the clean lab measuring metals and isotopes. My dissertation focused on metal accumulation in Florida lakes, which are pretty unique in themselves. And I looked at metals and how anthropogenic actions changed the metal accumulation over time. So, for example, when we had lead in our gasoline, you can see a huge spike in lead concentrations in lake sediments. But the important part of my dissertation, to answer your question, was as part of the PhD program, I was also a National Science Foundation Fellow as part of an interdisciplinary program to study different approaches to natural resource management. And what this allowed me to do was take a few classes at the law school at UF. And I joined the conservation clinic at the law school as a science consultant. And as part of this clinic, we worked with local watershed management groups and provided guidance to them using the law and regulations and, of course, science to help build best management practices. So a brief story. As part of this, we worked with the community in the Blackwater River watershed, which is in the Florida Panhandle. And though not unique to this river, a lot of activities, logging and clearing the floodplain for development, of course, led to changes in sedimentation patterns, changed property lines, altered habitat, and ultimately impacted water quality. So we looked at laws such as the Clean Water Act, namely the dredge and fill provisions and the Rivers and Harbors Act, and developed best management practices for these communities. So maybe embarrassing, maybe endearing, but I have to say that the dredge and fill permitting was my gateway drug to ultimately pursuing this career in science policy and regulation.
It's a fascinating background. No, it's so broad, and actually I could geek out on this stuff in a heartbeat, but
Same.
right.
So I still love working with lawyers, and thankfully the subject matter has only gotten more interesting for me. So,
well, that is absolutely the case. Well, let's kind of transition a little bit to Consumer Brands Association. I think many of our listeners are well aware of Consumer Brands Association and the wonderful things that the organization does. It represents the interest of the consumer packaged goods community, which is, just so important these days. Perhaps you can share some background on Consumer Brand Association's long history. It's been around a long, long time, and expand just maybe a little bit on what some of its key initiatives and projects are, and especially those on which you are working.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Consumer Brands Association, we are a trade association. We champion the consumer packaged goods, or lovingly known as the CPG industry.
Hmm.
So, we represent products that folks, you and me, Americans use every day. So, our members make household and personal care products, toilet paper, toothpaste, cleaning supplies. And then, of course, huge national food and beverage companies are members as well. We represent over 70 companies, and that includes over 2,000 brands.
Wow.
One thing that really struck me when I was learning about consumer brands was this industry specifically contributes $2.5 trillion to the US GDP. This represents about 10% of the national GDP. And with respect to jobs and employment, we support 22.3 million American jobs, represents about 10.5% of total U.S. Employment. So
Those numbers are really big. I had no idea.
Yes, that struck me. Yeah. Consumer brands began as the Grocers Manufacturers Association, GMA. Some folks might be familiar with that. And then it ultimately rebranded in 2020. So a few pillars of our work, I think there's a few things that really stand out at our work at the moment. Product policy is one, so this would cover nutrition, product safety, and then this also includes chemicals management, which is squarely my portfolio, looking at FDA and EPA regulations. We look at packaging and sustainability. We have a really strong extended producer responsibility group, molecular and advanced recycling, product or packaging sustainability. And then trade and tariffs has become ever more important
huge
for us. Yeah. So consumer packaged goods sources about 90% of our ingredients and inputs from American farmers and suppliers. But of course, there are certain things that either due to climate or geography or other factors just aren't available here in the U.S. I think coffee is the important one there that comes to mind immediately. So our team has worked pretty tirelessly over the past year plus to get tariff relief for these recognized key agricultural, we call them unavailable natural resources. And tin steel falls into that. So the tin steel that, of course, is on your can of tomatoes is also not totally manufactured here in the U.S. And so working for manufacturers to get relief for that as well is something we're working on.
I think COVID, if it taught us nothing else, it taught us the complexity of supply chains writ large, and the food and consumer packaged goods is no exception.
Absolutely. No, I think COVID was a real wake-up call for a lot of us in that respect, and understanding where things came from and the challenges with ensuring that we can get what we need in the time that we need it.
Well, I know you best, Susanna, given your scientific policy and communication background from EPA and your very storied, distinguished career there, serving well the interest of EPAers and the American public when you worked there at that agency. Given the interest of the Consumer Brands Association and its very large membership, I'm wondering if you can narrow down what has prepared you best for your new career, given the skill set that you amassed while working with the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started at EPA in the Office of Research and Development, and I will be forever thankful for my boss there. But in 2016, when the TSCA amendments were passed, she looked at me and said, "You need to go to the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics and work on TSCA."
Yep.
I was a AAAS Congressional Fellow, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I worked a little bit on TSCA amendments before it was passed. So it was quite familiar. So when I joined EPA and then moved to Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, I really was at the front lines of implementing the biggest environmental law in recent time. It was fascinating. I'm forever grateful for that experience. And I left about a year ago, almost exactly, to join Consumer Brands Association. A lot of really wonderful experiences from that to my current job. And so A few things I might point out. I led both the intra and interagency coordination for EPA and the toxics program. So, of course, chemicals aren't regulated just under TSCA. They're also regulated in the Office of Air, Office of Water. And I helped coordinate the agency's approach to managing the risks of chemicals. And then I also worked across the federal government. Federal agencies also use chemicals. DOD, or Department of Defense, Department of War comes to mind readily for that one. And so I worked across these agencies to ensure that their uses were coordinated and considered in our TSCA actions. And I think this translates really well to the work that any association does, of course, that we're working across memberships. Again, 70 members with varying views. But an association works on behalf of all their members, advancing, advocating interests for everyone as a whole. So I take feedback from a number of members and fold it into our industry position. Members might be competitors in the marketplace, but they have a shared interest in food policy approaches. So
absolutely
similar to the federal government, working across lines, across potentially differing interests to advance good, solid, robust policies.
Mm-hmm. No, I would imagine all those skills that you acquired at EPA are being put to excellent use at CBA.
I think another thing that really comes to mind is the role of science in regulation. While at EPA, I worked with some amazing scientists, both in the toxics program as well as ORD. And using science for regulation is a different beast than science in academia. There's true implications for science policy approaches. Choosing one uncertainty factor over another or a hazard endpoint can change dramatically what risk management looks like.
Yeah,
and this
we know
is
that well.
Yeah, I was going to say it's important for you and I in the food space now. And I think this allows me to work really well with industry scientists, advocate for them, understanding the bounds of the federal statutory and regulatory structure. And I think science is in a pretty tough place. I could list some reasons why, of course, but I think there's a lot of folks with a lot of platforms that can advance their own perspective du jour. A lot of noise on social media.
That may or may not be well grounded, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And so I think industry and the federal agencies are doing their best, though uphill battle in some cases, to advance transparent, robust science to make grounded regulatory decisions. And so I have to believe that science is going to have its place again in advancing really strong human and environmental protections.
I share that view and that hope. And it's a wonderful segue to my next question, which is Consumer Brands Association website, which I reviewed before our conversation, notes that the association, and I quote, adopted a proactive agenda that aligns with the values of the brands we represent and the consumers they serve, end quote. Perhaps you could expand a bit on what those values are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, always number one is going to be safety. Ingredient product safety is number one for our members for sure. And they do adhere to evidence-based safety standards established, of course, by the federal government. The next one that comes to mind is consumer choice and access, ensuring that consumers have a wide range of products and choices, both food, beverage, household products. And we partner with retailers of all different sizes to make sure that access and availability is there. Convenience, people are busy. Another goal is to make sure that families have easily accessible, convenient options so they can spend their precious time doing things that are more important. Value and affordability. I don't think it's any surprise that affordability, of course, is top of mind for so many of us. And grocery prices are really the most visible of that. They are what folks do every week, if not multiple times a week, going to the store, making sure they have what they need. And then transparency. Transparency has been a really key part of a lot of the work that we're doing. We just celebrated our second annual Consumer Transparency Week here at Consumer Brands.
No kidding. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. And I think in part, we really believe that there is this consumer desire for clear, accessible information about food and beverage and household and personal care products. And no matter where one lives, access to the same trusted, safe information and safe, affordable products is key here. And I think we might talk about this a bit later, but given some of the pressures that the industry is facing, approaching transparency and the need and the want of information is really, we're going to face that head on. And so that was kind of the goal of Transparency Week. And we had a number of events, both with our members, with the media, with the Hill. And it was all very productive and very, folks are really pleased with how it went. And I think that for me, one of the things that I think is a core tenet is regulatory certainty. I think this is the same for you and I, but understanding and having assurances that the regulations that industry must follow are clear and consistent. It helps folks plan. It creates a level of trust. And so that's one that I would add to the values here.
Absolutely. Clear, transparent, and enables the business community and others to be predictable. There's a lot in this world that is not predictable. So I would imagine that's a core tenet of the brand, as it were.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there is such an incredible focus, at least my perception is, Susanna, but on safety of food and beverage ingredients. I think over the years, this interest has really been growing, but it seems perhaps to have intensified because of the Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA advocacy that we hear so much about. How, if at all, and I'm not presuming here, but has the association adjusted its agenda and messaging to address MAHA issues, head on?
I do think that the MAHA movement has moved conversations out into the open. I think not just for food, chemicals, pesticides, and there's this definite increase in the consumer's desire, want, need, in some cases, for transparency. The response, in part, has been an increased demand for a variety of options with different nutritional characteristics, for example. And I think our member companies have been meeting consumer demands for generations. Scientists, safety experts, innovators at CPG companies are constantly innovating. They're developing products that provide more nutrients for humans, for pets, packagings with less waste, safer organic cleaning products. And we're really trying to meet consumers where they are, what they need. If you're gluten-free or want organic only, or trying
Vegan,
to avoid,
right.
trying to avoid colors, want more protein, more fiber. The CPG industry is trying to meet folks in the moment. As a mom, I think a lot about what I feed my kids. I have one kid who likes what she likes and another one who's open to trying some more stuff. But we need convenience, and we need to be able to trust what we're putting in our mouths, putting in our families' mouths. And I think the way we've approached that on the industry side is as consumer demands evolve. We've seen this with more need for more shelf-stable foods. When women went back into the workplace in the 50s, need more disposable diapers, and so we changed that. And so there's a changing approach now to color additives. So industry is really trying to meet the moment, so to speak, with the ever-evolving preferences of consumers. And I think it's important to also add, this also comes with a strong federal government, a robust science to ensure safety, predictable regulations that allow for this innovation change.
No, all of those things are just so important. And on the options front, there is such an amazing difference. When I was growing up, you had this, and that's about it. Now you have such
cereal
an amazing
aisle looks very different
right.
than it used to.
I will always love the cereal aisle in grocery stores.
Absolutely.
But I won't linger over food that perhaps might be improved upon, but old habits die hard.
I understand that deeply.
Well, I appreciated your short summary of your background with with TSCA, and I knew you were deep into TSCA, Suzanne. I didn't know you were really there at the beginning of the amendments back in 2016, all the way through, and all of the diverse roles you played in that. So
Yes, yeah.
that's fantastic. TSCA is such an important statute, and for we TSCA nerds, everything about it is fascinating. So I won't gonna go off message here. But
I'm in that camp with you.
well, we'll nerd out one of these days on TSCA. But given the intricacies of the law and your familiarity with it, I'm really understanding better how you can be putting your TSCA skills for really good use at CBA. But a specific question is, in your view, now that you've been there a little bit anyway, are there similarities in the regulatory space between TSCA and industrial chemicals and food safety, or at the least lessons learned from your EPA experience that you're able to carry forward and operationalize in your new role?
Yes, a resounding yes to that question. While I was at EPA, I was primarily on the existing chemicals side of the house.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with teams on prioritization and all the risk evaluations and risk management. I worked with the agency communications team on appropriate risk communication. And for the first really nearly 10 years of TSCA implementation, I was the lead rule writer for the first two of three of the risk evaluation rule. I'm in the nerdy camp, anxiously awaiting the third one, which I hope is imminent. And I think existing chemicals is one of the areas I've been able to bring some expertise and experience to consumer brands. So in the food side, FDA has been bolstering and investing in their post-market review program, essentially their existing chemicals program for food ingredients and substances. FDA is not required under law to perform this post-market review, but clearly, as we've talked about, the public, the agency, and industry have all recognized this is an essential step to ensure food safety. So the post-market program allows the agency to assess the safety of substances added directly or indirectly to food, and it provides food companies with this regulatory certainty we've talked about. In May of this year, FDA released their final approach for their post-market process. They released two documents. The first is entitled Enhanced Systematic Process for Post-Market Assessment of Chemicals in Food. This is a systematic approach to post-market safety. It describes how the FDA will monitor and triage information on hazards, use, exposure, and then prioritize substances for assessment, evaluation, and then ultimately risk management if needed. The process can involve looking at food additives. I think we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but generally recognized as safe substances, color additives. They can also look at food contact materials and as well as things we might consider contaminants, maybe metals is a good example of that. So it really is comprehensive. The second document in the release is essentially their prioritization process. They're calling it the Post-Market Assessment Prioritization Tool. It'll ring very similar to TSCA prioritization process, but the tool helps identify priority food chemicals for a full scientific assessment, and it focuses on potential risks to public health. It allows them to rank chemicals using criteria and scoring to focus on those real public health outcomes. So again, similar to prioritization under TSCA, identifying those kind of worst first, that idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And FDA says they will use this approach to create an annual work plan list. So they have one already. I think it's just over 30 substances. One of the groups that I think of interest are phthalates. So these are used in food packaging, as well as there's EPA jurisdiction, as I know you know. So I think this will be a really interesting space to watch as EPA continues with their risk management actions on phthalates, and FDA continues with their assessment, and it'll be interesting to see how the agencies hopefully work together on this.
Isn't it amazing how there's such great alignment between EPA chemical review and this new post-market review? And some of the people that you worked with at EPA were largely, at least got the ball rolling. You know, Jim Jones is a
Absolutely.
former FDA commissioner over there in food, and Mark Hartman, both worked at EPA, OPPT, and in other offices for years. You guys should have a little alumni group over there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I'm I'm feeling good about this. Having worked, a part
Yeah.
of my role was to work across agencies, and I
Mhm.
think federal government should speak with one voice, approaching things similarly, using similar science, using similar approach methods, to really get at the safety. I think that only lends itself to better consumer, um, clarity and trust that the things they're using, the chemicals that might be in their homes and the food that they might eat are have been evaluated well, appropriately, and are safe. So I'm heartened by the coordination there.
Absolutely.
Um, the a few other chemicals that
Mhm.
that may not be as familiar to the Tosca folks. The FDA has recently r- done 3 different requests for information looking at 2 food preservatives or antioxidants, and then a substance commonly used for flour whitening. They are doing a voluntary information gathering, and I think there's some some lessons learned there from Tosca as well. They're specifically looking for information regarding conditions of use, safety
Yep.
information, food categories, dietary exposure. They're also going to look at subpopulations that may have higher dietary exposure. So again, all reminiscent of some of our experiences with Tosca. And we've worked with our members on these requests for information. We've focused a lot on the long history and the safe use of these chemicals. And one thing that I have kind of clued in on is the risk communication piece. So, for example, some of these food ingredients have been in our food supply for 70 years in some cases, and their safety is being reaffirmed here in the U.S., but also other countries. And so the agency has to really consider the implications if, for example, they determine a condition of use is unsafe and move forward with risk management. How that becomes communicated to the public is going to be really important. There's going to be implications for this, particularly for a substance that has been deemed safe for decades after science and regulatory review, and now we're saying or determining that it's unsafe. And how do we communicate that to folks to not create a lack of
Panic,
trust?
right.
Yeah, or or panic. And I think that'll be really important. And so that's a space I am definitely watching for consumer brands, but also myself.
Well, your skill set from EPA will serve you well, and we always encourage our clients when a request for information comes out. It's a fabulous opportunity to get information into the record, educate people, disabuse information that may not be accurate or current. So participating in these initiatives is critically important so you can have a message that fairly reflects the science and the narrative that, consumer brand companies and others wish to promote.
Yeah. No, and I think we've learned over the years of Tosca that the more information the agency has, the
The
more,
better. Yeah.
yeah, the better regulation that we're going to get that is appropriate for the uses appropriate for industry, and most protective.
Let's talk a little bit about a topic that you just mentioned a bit ago, and that is the Consumer Brands Association's focus on FDA's generally recognized as safe framework. I think it's common knowledge or well respected that the GRAS framework, served a purpose and continues to serve a purpose, but perhaps has been the subject of criticism over the last, 10 years or so, and certainly by some of the public health community as a quote unquote loophole, basically allowing manufacturers to conclude independently and somewhat unilaterally that an ingredient is safe and foregoing FDA product approval. The association has been active in this space. What is the association's perspective on these issues, and how has the association been working to address them?
Yeah, I'm glad we get to talk about this. This is a big, important topic at the moment. So I'm glad to spend a few minutes on it. I think there's a few misconceptions that I want to clear up, but I think first, understanding the history of grass kind of sets the table here. So 1950s, I spoke about this a second ago, but there was this cultural shift. More women entered the workforce, but still were responsible for cooking, managing most, I would say, of the cooking and the household responsibilities. And the response of the food industry was to introduce more convenient items. And there were advancements at this time in refrigeration and frozen storage, so that we could store foods longer and maintain quality and safety. This was also made possible by the broad introduction of certain food additives, different preservatives. And so, with that backdrop, and then in 1958, Congress enacted the Food Additives Amendment, which amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FFDCA. And these amendments require that any substance intentionally added to food is a food additive and subject to pre-market approval. Unless, and this is the important important carve out, the food substance is generally recognized as safe or GRAS. And so Congress intentionally created this carve out for these substances. Congress recognized that many food additives or ingredients do not require pre-market safety review by FDA. So an easy example would be things like salt or vinegar that, of course, have been in our food system for generations, didn't need to be reviewed for safety. There were other ingredients, due to the nature of the food and the information that was generally available to scientists and to industry, that could also be considered GRAS. And so here is the nuance, that GRAS ingredients are not statutorily considered food additives, and thus food manufacturers are not required to submit information on these substances for pre-market review and approval by FDA, as they would for a food additive or a color additive. So, but I think companies still have to establish safety. They still have to meet the same reasonable certainty of no harm, which is the safety standard in FFDCA. And this is a general recognition of safety among experts that must be established. So this can be done in one of two ways. You can have experience as a common food before 1958. So this would be your vinegars, your salts, or scientific procedures based on the application of a general availability and accepted scientific data, information, or methods. And these are publicly available science that industry can point to and say, this ingredient is safe for these uses. So industry can do self-affirmed GRAS substances. They can do the science. They can keep the records. They can look at exposure, look at the history of use, look at subpopulations, and make those determinations. They can decide to voluntarily submit this information, and FDA can, in response, submit to them what's called a no questions letter, essentially approving this GRAS substance. These are all listed on the website. I think there's some 1,000 plus or minus on the website now. And this provides, of course, additional transparency. FDA can also conduct the post-market review on any of these substances. The agency can revoke a GRAS status if they determine that the substance no longer meets the criteria, and that substance would have to be removed from the market. I do think this process could be improved. I think a lot of folks are in that camp, and there could be greater understanding and visibility to how ingredients are evaluated before they enter the market. So there's both legislative and regulatory actions at play here, and we're pretty actively involved in both. I'll start with the legislative side. So Consumer Brands is part of a coalition, AFIT, or Americans for Ingredient Transparency, where we're advocating for federal legislation to establish ingredient uniformity for ingredients and disclosure, so labeling uniformity. And this part of this legislation is GRAS reform.
Mm-hmm.
It gives express authority to agencies to require mandatory GRAS notifications. So if you're bringing a new GRAS substance to market, you would have to let the agency know and send in appropriate information to show that it's GRAS. And then for existing GRAS ingredients, the government would have, or FDA would have to establish some kind of inventory so that there's greater transparency to those substances that may have been self-affirmed GRAS. So that legislation is underway. And then on the regulatory side, we are anxiously awaiting regulatory changes. The proposed regulation has been at OMB since December 1st of last year.
My goodness, it's been there a year?
Yeah. And
Almost?
the unified
Oh, geez.
the recently released
Mhm.
Unified Agenda has it coming out December of this year. So we
Fingers
anxiously await.
crossed.
Right. I refresh all mornings to see if it's published yet. But we know this rule would require the agency to keep an inventory of grass substances, would require mandatory notification of grass substances. And this is something that we're supportive of the agency updating. So there will be plenty more to talk about when we see this proposal when it is published.
If I were a betting person, and I'm not, I am betting that something will come out on the regulatory front, I hope this year. I the fact that it's been at OMB as long as it has could be good news, bad news, right?
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the importance of this and the agency
Yep.
getting it right,
Mhm.
um, and how impactful it could be, and it's a huge change in operations for companies. So
Well, I'd like to pivot to another, I think, important issue and one that I'm sure your organization and others are struggling with. We've been talking about the importance of regulatory consistency and predictability and uniformity in areas like TSCA and the 2016 amendments and all of the good things that have come out of that and some of the more predictable but less desirable outcomes that we are seeing with regard to states kind of taking it upon themselves to move in directions that are not necessarily aligned with other states or the federal approach to certain issues. As states advance their own food and chemical policies, what challenges does this growing patchwork create for the food industry, and how is the association dealing with that?
yeah, this is a we spend a lot of meetings, a lot of
No,
time
bet.
talking about this for sure. We have a very active, very strong state team here at Consumer Brands. And just to provide some perspective, in 2025, we tracked 151 product policy bills in 40 different states.
Wow.
10 states passed additive or ingredient bans in 2025. A number of these included banning food additives or color additives in schools. And one of the frustrating parts is the list of those additives weren't always the same from state to state. And so state patchwork, well, I know we all have PTSD with that phrase. Um, and of course, replacing an ingredient with another safe ingredient is a process. Testing to make sure that that ingredient fits the same function and properties in the food. There's a cost component. And then I think, as we've talked about, a supply component, new supply chains, new contracts to ensure that you have a constant flow of the needed ingredients. Other states have imposed specific labeling requirements. These include QR code requirements for certain additives if they're present, or specific label language requirements. Changing a label isn't a small thing for large companies either. It can take months to ensure that appropriate label changes, and then the outflow of those labels to ensure they're in the right shelves at the right times. Um, and I think if our end goal, which I believe is everyone's end goal, is to ensure that we have safe food and that customers get what they need, consumers' needs are met with respect to nutrition. Having a state patchwork isn't going to get us there, and I think
No.
this is reminiscent. This brings back a lot of Tosca memories, I'm sure, for those that worked on the amendments.
Yep.
Um, we just spoke about grass, and in New York, actually, there's a bill, SB 1239. It's actually sitting on Governor Hochul's desk. It would require food manufacturers to disclose the sale and use of these self-affirmed, so these, again, are those industry-affirmed grass substances. Companies would have to disclose, and then New York would have to keep this inventory on a public database. Similar bills have been introduced in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, California. There have been some projections here, but the New York legislation, if enacted, there's the projected state cost of $21 million in just the first 3 years, and our estimate is that it would increase grocery prices by 12%.
Wow.
Um, so I think that there are real economic consequences to the state patchwork that again, I'm not sure achieve our goals of protecting human health. So we've been watching all these really closely. There's other bills that look to limit, of course, food and drug cosmetic or FD&C colors. In some cases, these ingredients are added to lists for prohibition because they're banned in other countries. This poses problems for companies that are making products that go across different states,
Globally.
of course.
Absolutely.
And it costs money to make different labels. And in some cases, it may be prohibitive to some. So again, some deja vu for Tosca, but yeah, this is something that is we spend a lot of time thinking about and working on.
And I know there are like a ton of other top of mind issues that the association also engages in on a policy and science policy front. Plastics, extended producer responsibility, something that we're spending an extraordinary amount of time here at the firm, and microplastics, which
Yeah.
is, big in the EU, but, we're a lot of different state jurisdictions and other venues here in the States are catching up quickly.
Yeah.
How are you parsing those issues? Are they equally important, or you're prioritizing some but not all?
Yeah, no, all of equal importance, and we have a lot of expertise here at Consumer Brands, particularly in the extended producer responsibility, and that's primarily covered by our state team.
Mhm.
But I'm closely following the federal and state actions around microplastics, and definitely a topic that I think will become increasingly more interesting. I think a lesson that carries across every regulatory issue that we've worked on is the importance of grounding the policy in sound science and realistic risk assessments. Many industries, including the consumer packaged goods, become the focus of public concern because it's visible, because you can see really clearly if you open a bag of potato chips, microplastics. I think that's maybe where some folks it's easy to see that. What may not be as easily to see is like a plastic bag degrading in the middle of the ocean. And so the visibility can create calls for policy action before we really understand the underlying science. So I think there's tension there. Important scientific questions that, of course, deserve continued research, and we're seeing that at the federal level. And then we need to really distinguish what we know, what we don't know, and what policy outcomes are really being sought. What are some good answers here? So that's definitely a space that I will be watching pretty closely.
I see an expansion in your team in the future there,
Right.
'cause every one of these topics is ginormous, right?
Oh, so true, so true.
Well, let's close on a topic that I know is very important to the Consumer Brands Association. That's what transparency, and ensuring that both members and the consumers they serve feel like they are giving information that is suitable for making decisions, is accurate, and can be relied upon. You have got at least two programs of which I'm aware, the Smart Label and Facts Up Front program, that really strive to enhance transparency and engage with both consumer brand association member companies and the consumers they serve. But maybe you can tell a little bit more about what these programs are and why they are so important to the association.
Absolutely. We've talked a number of times now about the importance of transparency and consumers wanting, deserving to know what's in their food, to understand where it came from. So yeah, we have two programs here at Consumer Brands that were born out of listening to consumers and wanting to meet that need. I'll start with Smart Label. So this is Consumer Brands Association and some member companies created Smart Label. It's a digital disclosure tool, so you can use your phone, scan a QR code, and you get really detailed information about allergens, where ingredients came from, packaging, recycling instructions, all from this code. It was created in 2015, and at the moment, I think we have 80 major companies using Smart
Wow.
Label. Represents 1,000 brands and over 100,000 individual products. The QR codes are becoming, of course, an increasingly important tool to learn
Mhm.
about products, and also a way for industry to share more important information. So I think an important use and rather timely is that it's been shown that we could use QR codes for lot traceability. So this becomes really
Mm-hmm.
important if, for example, there is a recall on a product for any particular reason. A consumer could scan the code, and since manufacturers input all the information into Smart Label program, they could update information on their end to ensure that consumers are getting up-to-date information about lot codes and any recalls that may be associated. So I think this could be a really powerful tool to that end. Um,
Absolutely.
Another example is recycling. Recycling is different in wherever you live, and so you can use this QR code, and it can be updated to reflect the recycling in the specific area that you are, so you know if a particular product is recyclable and how to do that. So I think it's good. These QR codes are going to become increasingly more nuanced, provide more and more information that really helps consumers know what products they have. And then facts up front. So industry has worked in partnership with FDA for about 15 years to improve the accessibility of critical nutrition information and promote nutrition literacy. And so what is born out of this is what we call facts up front. So of course you have the full nutrition on usually the back of your product, but on the front on some products in black and white are some key nutrition information. This might include nutrition or nutrients to encourage, fiber, protein, but also may include nutrients to limit, maybe the number of calories,
Mm-hmm.
saturated fat, added sugar. So it's a very quick, easy way for consumers to see on the front of their package to learn more about the nutrition information in their product. So we will continue to work with FDA to advance this. I think it is a priority for the agency to continue to educate consumers on good nutrition, help them
Absolutely.
understand to educate. So that's another initiative that we are championing here.
Fabulous programs. I'm gonna have to go to the supermarket more often than I do and give my iPhone a workout.
There
I
you
think
go.
it's just a great idea, and I'm guessing you're finding that more and more consumers are, actually utilizing these tools, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think we had a statistic for the smart label, the QR code. We've seen, I think, a 43% increase year over
Oh my
year
word,
from
really?
2024 to 2025. Yeah, I think the folks want to know more. And so we're seeing that. The data bears that out. Absolutely.
Well, speaking of knowing more, if you want more information on Consumer Brands Association, you have a fabulous website at consumerbrandsassociation.org. Lots of really useful information on these programs that you've discussed, Suzanne, and many, many more that time did not permit us to pursue.
Yeah, no, I think we've had our website revamped in the last year, and folks have done a really wonderful job in making things easily accessible and a lot of really good information.
Well, Dr. Susanna Blair, thank you. This has been a fascinating, really fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your passion and your know-how with our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground, and it really has been quite a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks again to Dr. Blair for speaking with me today and sharing her insights with her work at CBA, the association's key policy initiatives, and how she is transitioning her considerable science, policy, and communication skills acquired through years of service at EPA to CBA member companies and the public. All Things Chemicals produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.